There's a popular idea about ancient humans that gets repeated so often it basically became common knowledge without anyone checking if it was actually true. That our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived in a constant, brutal cycle of feast and famine, gorging on a mammoth when the hunt went well, and then starving for weeks until the next lucky kill finally came along. This idea is so deeply embedded in modern thinking that it became the foundation of an entire scientific theory used to explain why so many people today struggle with obesity and diabetes. The idea that our bodies are essentially still bracing for a famine that, for most of us living in the modern world, is never actually going to come. Here's the twist nobody saw coming. When researchers finally sat down and actually tested whether hunter-gatherers experienced more frequent or more severe famine than other types of societies, the data said something genuinely surprising. They didn't. If anything, hunter-gatherers appear to have experienced famine less often and less severely than the farmers who came after them, and adopted what most people consider a more advanced way of life. The popular image of the starving caveman, perpetually one bad hunt away from death, gaunt and desperate between kills, turns out to be considerably more myth than fact, and the real story of how ancient humans handled hunger is a genuinely fascinating mix of clever social engineering, surprising dietary flexibility, underrated scavenging skills, and a body that, it turns out, was never quite as desperate for that mammoth as we've always assumed it was. Let's start by dismantling the myth itself, because understanding exactly why it's wrong tells you almost everything you need to know about how ancient humans actually managed food scarcity in practice. A landmark study analyzing a large cross-cultural database of documented hunter-gatherer societies set out specifically to test the assumption baked into decades of popular science writing and textbook illustrations: that foraging populations live constantly on the edge of starvation, one missed hunt away from disaster. What the researchers actually found directly contradicted that widespread, rarely questioned assumption. Hunter-gatherer groups experienced lean periods that were typically seasonal or tied to specific, localized resource disruptions, the kind of temporary dip any community might weather, but multi-year famines causing significant mortality were genuinely uncommon across the populations studied. Serious local shortages might occur every few decades in a given environment, often following prolonged drought or some other disruption to a key resource like a fish run or a particular plant harvest. But social mechanisms within these communities usually prevented those shortages from escalating into the kind of mass starvation events that show up so frequently in historical records. Compare that to early agricultural societies, where the picture looks considerably grimmer and considerably more fragile. Crop failures capable of triggering genuine famine could occur in essentially any drought year without warning, and recurrent, multi-year subsistence crises became common in many regions, particularly where farming first intensified, and where storage practices and growing social inequality both increased simultaneously, concentrating risk in ways hunter-gatherer life simply didn't. The archaeobotanical and historical record backs this up clearly and consistently. Frequent crop failures, grain price spikes, and well-documented famines appear constantly throughout agrarian societies from the Neolithic onward, while large-scale famine records for hunter-gatherer populations remain comparatively rare across the same broad span of recorded and inferred history. The short version is almost the exact opposite of what most people instinctively assume. Hunter-gatherer groups experienced fewer, shorter, and less severe famines than the early farming communities that eventually replaced them across most of the world. So why does the constant starvation myth persist so stubbornly, despite the evidence pointing firmly the other way? Partly because settling down and farming looks, on the surface, like obvious linear progress, which makes it genuinely counterintuitive to imagine that the lifestyle agriculture replaced might have actually been more food secure in important, measurable ways. And partly because the thrifty gene hypothesis, the scientific theory built directly on the assumption of constant ancestral feast and famine cycling, became so influential in medical and evolutionary research throughout the 20th century that its underlying premise rarely got seriously, rigorously questioned for decades at a time. We'll come back to that theory shortly, because its story is genuinely one of the more interesting scientific course corrections in recent memory, and it ties everything in this video together by the end. So if hunter-gatherers weren't constantly starving the way popular imagination insists, what were they actually doing to keep food scarcity from turning into genuine, life-threatening crisis? The answer is a remarkably sophisticated toolkit, built not around any single brilliant solution, but around several overlapping strategies working together simultaneously, each one covering for the weaknesses of the others. The first and probably most important strategy was dietary breadth. Hunter-gatherer populations relied on what researchers call broad-spectrum foraging, drawing simultaneously from meat, fish, nuts, tubers, fruits, shellfish, and wild grains, depending on whatever the local environment happened to offer across the changing seasons of the year. This mattered enormously because it meant a hunter-gatherer group's survival never depended on any single food source succeeding on any given day. If the big game hunt failed for a week straight, there were still tubers to dig up from the ground, nuts to gather from nearby trees, and shellfish to collect along a convenient shoreline. Compare this deliberately diversified approach to early agricultural societies, which increasingly concentrated their entire caloric intake around just one or two staple crops: wheat, barley, rice, maize, depending on the specific region and climate. That narrow concentration created tremendous efficiency and impressive caloric output when growing conditions were good, but it also created enormous brittle fragility when conditions inevitably turned bad, because a single crop failure could wipe out the overwhelming majority of an entire community's food supply in just one disappointing growing season. Hunter-gatherers, by spreading their dietary risk across dozens of genuinely different food sources at once, had effectively built in a kind of natural insurance policy against any single resource failing without anyone ever consciously designing it that way. The second major strategy was mobility itself, a freedom that farming communities deliberately traded away the moment they committed to tilled fields. Because hunter-gatherers didn't depend on cultivated land tied permanently to one fixed location, they could simply move when local conditions deteriorated, following resources as they naturally shifted across the surrounding landscape, or relocating entirely away from an area experiencing depletion or drought. This required access to surprisingly large territories, with estimates suggesting hunter-gatherer groups typically needed access to anywhere from 7 to 500 square miles of land, depending on the richness and reliability of the local environment, which sounds like an enormous amount of space until you realize that having that much room to roam was precisely what let them sidestep localized food crises that would have devastated a population permanently tied to one settlement. Farmers, by definition, gave up this option the moment they invested heavily in tilled fields, irrigation systems, granaries, and permanent dwellings that couldn't simply be picked up and carried elsewhere. When the soil failed or the rains didn't come on schedule, a farmer couldn't simply pack up their entire livelihood and walk somewhere else the way a forager could within days. But perhaps the single most clever strategy ancient humans developed wasn't actually about acquiring food sources at all. It was about social structure, specifically the deliberate, culturally enforced way food got distributed throughout the group once it was actually acquired by whoever happened to succeed that day. Researchers studying food-sharing networks in documented hunter-gatherer societies have found something genuinely elegant in how these communities organize the distribution of scarce resources among their members. Rather than every individual or every household fending entirely for themselves in isolation, successful hunters typically shared their kills widely across the broader group, creating an interconnected, ongoing web of obligation and reciprocity that functioned as a kind of biological insurance system spread across the entire community. If you had a good hunt today and shared generously with everyone around you, you could reasonably expect others to share with you during your own future lean stretches when your own luck inevitably ran out for a while. A detailed mathematical analysis of these sharing networks found that the specific structure minimizing the risk of both individual and group starvation tends to organize itself around tightly cohesive clusters built specifically around the hunters who are actively injecting fresh food into the broader system at any given time, with sharing flowing outward from successful hunters first to their immediate families, and then more broadly across the wider community in layered, predictable waves of distribution. This sharing system meant that hunting success didn't need to be consistent for any single individual hunter in order for the group as a whole to survive comfortably through any given stretch of time. As long as someone in the band was successful on any given day or week, the resulting food got distributed widely enough that nobody faced an immediate personal crisis, smoothing out the natural, unavoidable unpredictability of any individual hunt across the entire community, rather than letting that unpredictability fall entirely on whichever specific family happened to come up empty-handed that particular day. This is, in a very real and quantifiable sense, a primitive but genuinely effective form of risk pooling, the exact same underlying mathematical principle behind modern insurance markets and mutual aid societies, except built directly into the social fabric of small ancestral bands through deeply held norms of reciprocity and mutual obligation rather than through any formal written contract or modern financial institution. There's also a survival strategy that researchers have only recently started to fully appreciate and take seriously, and it involves something that sounds considerably less glamorous than dramatic mammoth hunting, but may have actually been more important to long-term, day-to-day survival than the spear-throwing heroics that dominate popular imagination: scavenging. For decades, scavenging was treated dismissively in popular science writing as a primitive, somewhat embarrassing phase that early humans supposedly abandoned the moment they developed better, more dignified hunting skills. Essentially the evolutionary equivalent of eating cold leftovers before humanity finally learned to cook a proper meal for itself. But more recent, more rigorous research has overturned that condescending assumption entirely. A study led by researchers at the National Research Center on Human Evolution found that scavenging animal carcasses wasn't some desperate, shameful last resort our ancestors were quietly embarrassed by and abandoned as soon as possible. It was a smart, deliberate, genuinely reliable survival strategy that required far less energy expenditure than actively hunting live, fleeing prey while still providing genuinely calorie-rich, nutrient-dense food. And during periods of real environmental scarcity, carrion may have actually been one of the single most dependable food sources available to early humans at all, more reliable in many ways than the unpredictable outcome of any individual hunt. What made humans uniquely capable of successfully exploiting scavenged food, when most other animals simply cannot safely eat carcasses that have been sitting exposed for any meaningful length of time, was a specific combination of biological and technological advantages working together in concert. Strong stomach acid allowed early humans to digest meat that had already started decomposing somewhat, killing off many of the dangerous pathogens that would sicken other species attempting the exact same meal without that same protection. Long-distance walking ability meant humans could cover enormous stretches of territory, searching methodically for carcasses that other predators had already killed and abandoned, often arriving while substantial usable meat and fat still remained before competing scavengers could fully strip the kill down to bare bone. And critically, the combination of fire, stone tools, and basic cooperative group behavior meant humans could process and thoroughly cook scavenged meat in ways that further neutralized whatever bacterial risk still remained, while simultaneously extracting genuinely valuable, calorie-dense resources like fat and bone marrow that other scavengers lacking tools simply couldn't access no matter how badly they needed the calories. Researchers studying this dynamic now describe scavenging as having worked seamlessly alongside hunting and plant gathering as part of one flexible, fully integrated food strategy, rather than existing as some separate, inferior backup plan reserved only for the most desperate emergencies imaginable. When a hunt failed outright or when plant foods happened to be scarce that particular season, scavenging was simply one more reliable, well-understood card sitting in the deck, not a humiliating last resort that ancient humans tried desperately to avoid whenever possible. Now let's talk about what happens inside the human body itself when food actually does run short, despite all of these careful social and dietary safeguards. Because this is where the story takes a genuinely fascinating biological turn, and where that popular thrifty gene hypothesis we mentioned earlier comes circling back into the picture. When the human body is deprived of food for an extended period, it doesn't simply weaken and shut down in a straightforward, linear, predictable fashion. It moves instead through a remarkably structured, multi-stage sequence of adaptations specifically designed by evolution to extend survival for as long as biologically possible under the circumstances. In the first 24 to 48 hours without any food intake, the body burns steadily through its readily available glycogen stores held in the liver and muscles, while simultaneously increasing gluconeogenesis, the active production of new glucose from amino acids and glycerol, specifically to keep blood sugar levels at a survivable threshold for brain function. After this initial window passes, something considerably more sophisticated kicks in automatically. The body shifts decisively toward ketogenesis, switching the brain's primary fuel source away from glucose and toward ketone bodies derived directly from stored body fat, a fundamental metabolic transition that dramatically reduces the rate at which the body needs to break down its own valuable muscle protein for emergency fuel. Overall metabolic rate itself drops measurably as part of this broader transition, mediated partly through deliberate changes in thyroid hormone activity, conserving precious energy and stretching available fat reserves considerably further than a naive, simple calculation of calories in versus calories out would ever predict on paper. After roughly 4 to 5 days of total food deprivation, the body settles into a relatively stable, almost sustainable metabolic state, burning primarily fat and ketones at a deliberately, automatically reduced metabolic rate. A state that can sustain a person, depending heavily on their individual starting body composition, for a little over a month in someone who started out thin, or potentially over a full year in someone carrying substantial fat reserves, before total, irreversible starvation finally becomes fatal. This is precisely the elegant biological machinery that originally inspired the thrifty gene hypothesis, first proposed back in the 1960s, which suggested that specific genes promoting unusually efficient fat storage during times of plenty would have offered a major, measurable survival advantage to ancestral humans who supposedly faced regular, unpredictable famine throughout their evolutionary history, and that those very same genes, now operating largely unchecked in a thoroughly modern world of constant, easy food abundance, are largely responsible for today's widespread obesity and diabetes epidemics sweeping across industrialized nations. It's an elegant, deeply intuitive theory that fits neatly into a simple evolutionary narrative. And for several decades, it genuinely dominated mainstream thinking about the evolutionary roots of modern metabolic disease. But here's where the story circles back directly to where we started this entire video, because that famine frequency research we covered earlier directly undermines the theory's most basic core assumption. If hunter-gatherers genuinely weren't experiencing the kind of frequent, severe, population-thinning famines that the thrifty gene hypothesis explicitly requires in order for thrifty genes to actually spread meaningfully through natural selection over time, then the entire foundation of the theory becomes considerably shakier and more questionable than its widespread popularity would otherwise suggest to most people. Researchers including Jonathan Speakman have proposed compelling alternative explanations instead, suggesting that rather than direct, active natural selection specifically for efficient fat storage, the relevant genes may simply have drifted randomly through the broader human population, once an earlier, more powerful evolutionary pressure, namely predation risk for individuals who happened to be too overweight to outrun or escape predators effectively, was largely removed roughly 2 million years ago thanks to the arrival of fire, handheld weapons, and organized cooperative social defense against large carnivores. Without predators actively culling the heaviest, slowest individuals from the population generation after generation, genetic variation in overall body fatness was simply set free to drift in ways it previously structurally couldn't, with no famine-driven selective pressure required at all to fully explain the pattern of body weight variation we actually observe across human populations today. This remains a genuinely active, unresolved, and occasionally contentious scientific debate within evolutionary medicine, but it stands as a striking example of how an entire influential field of obesity research was confidently built for decades on top of an underlying assumption about ancient hunger that, once researchers finally got around to actually testing it directly and rigorously against real cross-cultural data, turned out to be considerably weaker and shakier than virtually anyone studying the topic had assumed it would be. So how did ancient humans actually handle hunger when it did inevitably show up despite their best efforts? Not, it turns out, through constant white-knuckle survival lived perpetually on the edge of starvation, desperately awaiting the next lucky kill the way popular imagination has always pictured it happening. They handled it through remarkable, deliberate dietary flexibility, drawing on dozens of genuinely different food sources simultaneously so that no single failure of any one resource could ever threaten the survival of the whole group at once. They handled it through mobility, simply walking away from emerging trouble rather than being forced to endure it helplessly in one fixed location. The painful trade-off settled farmers eventually had to accept once they committed to tilled fields. They handled it through careful social engineering, deliberately building food-sharing networks that quietly pooled risk across an entire interconnected community long before anyone had ever invented the formal concept of insurance or written a single contract. They handled it through scavenging, a genuinely smart, underrated, and historically underappreciated strategy rather than some shameful last resort reserved for the truly desperate. And when genuine scarcity did finally arrive, despite all of that careful preparation and social structure, their own bodies handled the remaining gap through an elegant, carefully sequenced, multi-stage metabolic shutdown process specifically built by millions of years of evolution to stretch out survival for as long as biologically, physiologically possible. The real surprise buried in all of this isn't simply that ancient humans found clever, resourceful ways to survive hunger when it eventually struck. It's that they may have actually been considerably better at avoiding it in the first place through structure, flexibility, and cooperation than the farmers, and arguably even some modern populations, who came after them and assumed they had it figured out better. The starving caveman, it turns out, was never quite as hungry as we've all spent decades assuming he must have been.